For Section 6, acknowledging the trauma, we will focus on identifying the trauma, intergenerational trauma, and consequences of intergenerational trauma. For this quote, challenging power structures from the inside, working the cracks within the system, however, requires learning to speak multiple languages of power convincingly. And for the protesters throughout the country who have been profiling or protesting police violence, we have learned to speak truth to power. And we would like more of you to speak truth to power so that we can change this. Dealing and healing from trauma. We have to acknowledge the trauma. Acknowledge that trauma exists as it relates to violence in America, police violence in America. Acknowledging the trauma, according to research, police violence against racial and ethnic marginalized persons as a direct cataclysmic racial and current event. These events can range from witnessing police violence against another person and racial microaggressions, such as being called a racial slur by a police officer, to threat of harm, physical assault, or even murder. Symptoms include depression, anxiety, anger, fear, trust, and other psychosocial problems. Intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma, also known as historical trauma, refers to families or cultural groups that have been or have experienced severe trauma, such as wars, extreme poverty, dislocation, enslavement, genocide, for which descendants continue to suffer the consequences. Descendants who did not experience the trauma directly can still evidence signs of symptoms of distress related to the trauma. Intergenerational trauma is in descendants of Holocaust survivors find parental PTSD results in genetic transmission of vulnerable to trauma symptoms. In other words, children of parents with PTSD were significantly more likely to exhibit dissociative states and biomarkers of PTSD. And when we think about that, we in society today give plenty of research, plenty of authenticity to the survivors of the Holocaust, but we have not done so when it comes to survivors of those who were enslaved in this country. And we need to do more of that. Because when we think about some of the consequences of this PTSD, we have a number of symptoms. The descendants of trauma survivors who are culturally marginalized, such as African American Indians, may have direct experiences of trauma in different stages of their lives, but these traumas should not be divorced from historical intergenerational trauma of their current cultural communities. Consequences of intergenerational trauma. The consequences of intergenerational trauma include depression, psychological distress, PTSD, anger, suicidality, aggression, substance dependence, distrust, internalized oppression, in which the individual adopts the view of the oppressors, resulting in self-hatred and self-destructive behavior. And we see that often in African American communities, where some people state that, why are you arguing about police violence when you have violence amongst people of color, black on black crime? And might I add, this is exactly the case. But what we do not do is we do not look at what are some of the root causes and why does this community feel this way? And if we, as mental health professionals, spend more time addressing that, we will not ask this question moving forward. The long-term persistent effects of enslavement have been discussed in the psychological literature as post-traumatic slave syndrome, and some scholars have further posited that instead of many ethnic minorities experiencing post-traumatic stress, they experience ongoing traumatic stress because of the continued widespread exposure to racism, violence, and intergenerational poverty. Also, please see Post-Traumatic Slave Disorder by Dr. Joy DeGruy. Her book is very insightful as it relates to post-traumatic slave disorder, and many of you will be enlightened at how this correlates with what we're seeing today in America. Thank you.